Welcome to the English Language Institute of Singapore's podcast. I'm May Yin. This is the 9th episode in the series on inquiry through dialogue. Our conversation in today's episode is on inquiry through dialogue in the teaching and learning of grammar. With me are two teachers, Ms. Melody Heng, who is a teacher of English language in Temasek Primary School, and a recipient of the Inspiring Teacher of English Award in 2022, and Mr. Jerome Lim, Subject Head Literature in Whitley Secondary School, who is also a teacher of English language. He was a nominee for the Inspiring Teacher of English Award in 2024. You will listen to both of them speak about their classroom enactment of inquiry through dialogue in the teaching and learning of grammar. Hi, Melody and Jerome. So happy to have you in this dialogic discussion.
Hi, May.
Hello.
Melody and Jerome, now tell us, why do you believe in the practice of inquiry through dialogue in the teaching of grammar?
You know, when I think about how inquiry through dialogue looks like in a classroom, I think of an engaging and noisy lesson. However, when my students hear the word grammar, other things immediately come to mind. Red ink all over their essays, endless lists of confusing rules, and those dreaded 100 practice blue assessment books. It's no wonder grammar feels rigid and honestly, sometimes painful for our students. So how do we change that? For me, I think the key to engaging our students is to stop dictating to them grammar rules, simply stating this is correct, this is wrong, but instead, through inquiry through dialogue, get them to engage with grammar in a more dynamic way, as something they can actually explore and figure out for themselves.
Jerome, is it so easy to stop dictating to students grammar rules, especially when they have been so acculturated to learning grammar rules by heart?
Of course, this is much easier said than done, May Yin. But I think it is really important to build a culture to make our students excited about grammar. So what do you think, Melody?
Yes, Jerome, I really agree with your inductive approach. Like you, I arouse interest in my students and guide them to notice and pose open-ended questions that get them to think critically. In the practice of inquiry through dialogue, students co-construct knowledge with one another while at the same time adjusting their own beliefs and ideas. I recently used inquiry through dialogue when I taught my lower primary students past and present tense. Through this whole-part-whole approach, they notice before zooming in to unpack a grammatical aspect. Thereafter, we go back to the whole again to consolidate the learning. Although not all the ideas given by them were accurate, it presented me with opportunities to explain to the class using the meta-language and clear misconceptions. Grammar becomes more approachable in this guided and collaborative environment where students know they are safe to learn and make mistakes. How about you, Jerome?
Wow, Melody, that certainly sounds exciting. I think the sort of learner-centric constructive discussions that you promote through inquiry through dialogue is what I look for in my classroom as well. And Melody, I absolutely agree with you that we need to make grammar more approachable. When my students think of grammar as a set of rules, they get very frustrated when they find what they think are exceptions. For example, one thing my students struggle with is preposition use, because preposition use is idiomatic, and that throws students off a lot. Because once you mention that preposition use is idiomatic, you find that eventually you keep saying everything is idiomatic and leave students feeling that their knowledge is incomplete. So rather than giving in to the urge to just tell them grammar rules like you, Melody, I guide them through the posing of open-ended questions to notice patterns in language, and from this, I see that they naturally get more engaged.
Melody, what is a visualization of the practice of inquiry through dialogue in the teaching and learning of grammar in your classrooms?
My ideal inquiry through dialogue classroom is a safe environment where students are confident enough to make mistakes and negotiate meaning with their peers. In lessons, I encourage my students to notice and become curious about grammar, often through the use of authentic texts. I often tell them they are like little detectives uncovering the mysteries.
That's a great way to put it, Melody. In my classroom, I take a similar process-oriented approach, but with secondary school students being more independent learners, allegedly, I like to start by throwing my students off a little, what I call productive irritation. I'll put up two sentences like, I go to school every day, versus, I go to the school every day, and ask them which one is correct. When they pick one, I neither confirm nor deny, I just say, what do you think? And then introduce another example with a slightly different context. And I keep going on without offering answers first. This little bit of doubt makes them stop and really think about the why instead of just assuming they know the rule. But Melody, the important part is what comes after. I get them to look towards their peers. There's quite a number of international students in my school, so often I intentionally mix international and local students in groups because they approach grammar differently. I realized that when these two groups talk things out, they actually end up teaching each other. So one thing I noticed is that our local students like to explain why something just feels right, while my second language learners often push for more logical rule-based explanation. And I find that this back and forth sharing is where the magic happens. Grammar stops being about memorization and starts becoming about discovery.
Jerome, that's really very interesting what you've just highlighted about the inductive approach to the teaching and learning of grammar rather than just the deductive approach. Melody, you were about to say your view?
Yes, I think that inquiry through dialogue's underlying principles are the same no matter which level we teach. Going back to our English language syllabus, let's not forget that exploratory talk is important as learning is deepened and an awareness of grammatical knowledge is developed. By using meta-language for learning and talking about language structures, students will be able to understand how grammar is like the glue that holds sentences together and how it is so purposeful in meaning-making. Without grammar, it is impossible to be clear and articulate.
I definitely have a very strong visualization of your practice of inquiry through dialogue in the teaching and learning of grammar. Now, I'd like to know, Melody and Jerome, have you seen impactful differences in terms of your students' learning and their use of language through your practice of inquiry through dialogue?
May Yin, I feel that the practice of inquiry through dialogue has had a significant impact on my students' learning and development in many areas. The use of inquiry through dialogue allows my students to be more inquisitive and confident, especially in the learning of English grammar. Now, they are the ones who often ask me questions. Miss Heng, is it possible to have all three tenses, the past, the present, and the future tenses in one sentence? It makes me happy to hear such questions, as I know that they are thinking critically and are curious about the English language. They are intrinsically motivated, and I believe that this increased confidence also extends beyond the classroom. What about you, Jerome?
I completely agree with you, Melody. Yes, May Yin, one of the most rewarding things about inquiry through dialogue is seeing my students become more self-directed in their learning. And wow, it's great to hear from you, Melody, that this shift starts even in the primary years. By the time my students reach secondary school, I want them to move away from thinking of grammar as just right or wrong and instead start questioning text with a lot more independence. And thinking about the enhanced 21st century competency model, I find self-directedness is so crucial, especially now when they are constantly navigating information from so many different sources. For me, teaching them to critically engage with language isn't just about school. It's about navigating life itself. I find practicing inquiry through dialogue really does make our students more inquisitive. Do you see that in your students, Melody?
I agree, Jerome. As educators who want to see such inquisitive disposition in our students, we need to guide our students to develop metacognitive skills. And this is where inquiry through dialogue comes in. With such exploratory talk, students will learn to uncover and reflect on their own learning process. As such, one of the most notable differences I've observed is in the quality of their thought processes and answers.
Melody and Jerome, it seems to me that inquiry through dialogue is a very useful approach for building 21st century competencies. Your thoughts?
I agree. How about you, Jerome?
Yes, definitely, I agree as well.
I think the importance of such exploratory talk and metacognitive strategies are also clearly stated in the English language syllabus, as it helps students to achieve 21st century competencies across all areas of language learning, May Yin.
Melody and Jerome, thank you so very much for giving us valuable insights into your classroom practices of inquiry through dialogue in the teaching and learning of grammar.
Thanks for having us, May Yin. That was great.
Yay.
Thank you.
You've just listened to an episode of the Teaching, Learning and Assessment podcast series from the English Language Institute of Singapore. To find out more about the ELIS podcast, visit go.gov.sg/ELIS podcast. Thank you for listening.